January 17th, 1946. Yokohama Prefecture, Japan. The winter sun hung low over the ruins of what had once been a thriving industrial district. Smoke no longer rose from the skeletal remains of factories. The fires had long since burned out, leaving only ash and silence. In the shadow of a collapsed textile mill, a young woman named Kimiko Tanaka clutched a tin cup in both hands, her knuckles white from cold and fear. She had not eaten a full meal in 11 days. Around her, other civilians, elderly men, mothers with hollow-eyed children, stood in a ragged line that stretched down the rubble-strewn street. They had been told to assemble here by the occupation forces. No one knew what would happen next. Then the trucks arrived. They were olive green and massive, American vehicles that seemed to dwarf the narrow streets of devastated Yokohama. Soldiers jumped down from the backs of the trucks, their boots striking the broken pavement with a sound that made Kimiko flinch. For months, she had been taught to fear these men. The propaganda had told her they would be demons, that they would violate, torture, and destroy without mercy. But instead of rifles pointed at the crowd, the soldiers began unloading wooden crates. One young GI, his face sunburned and freckled, looked directly at Kimiko and smiled. Then he spoke words she didn't understand, but his gesture was unmistakable. He was inviting her forward, toward food. This moment, small, unremarkable in the grand sweep of history, would fracture everything Kimiko had been taught to believe about the world, to understand. The shock that would ripple through Japanese civilian consciousness. In the months following surrender, one must first understand the nature of the war they had just lost. For 14 years, the Japanese people had been conditioned by a totalitarian military government that had transformed their nation into an engine of conquest. Beginning with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and accelerating through the full-scale invasion of China in 1937, Japan's imperial ambitions had consumed the lives of millions, both enemy and its own citizens. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the average Japanese civilian had been subjected to years of propaganda that painted Americans as racially inferior, morally bankrupt, and fundamentally barbaric. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as Japan's imperial project was called, was marketed to the Japanese population as a liberation of Asia from Western colonialism. But the reality was far darker. Japanese military policy toward conquered populations was marked by extraordinary brutality. The rape of Nanking, the forced labor of Korean comfort women, the Bataan Death March, the systematic starvation of prisoners of war. Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that death was preferable to captivity. And if this was how they viewed their own fate, their treatment of conquered peoples reflected an even deeper contempt. Japanese civilians, meanwhile, suffered under their own government's increasingly desperate war economy. By 1944, rice rations had been cut to starvation levels. The average civilian's daily caloric intake had dropped below 1/500 calories, barely enough to sustain basic metabolic function. Children stopped growing. The elderly simply faded away. The firebombing campaigns conducted by American B-29s in 1945 turned Japan's cities into infernos. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. More than 60 cities were subjected to incendiary attacks that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and left millions homeless. Then came Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki 3 days later. Atomic fires that vaporized entire neighborhoods and announced the arrival of a new and terrifying age. When Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio on August 15, 1945, announcing Japan's surrender, many civilians wept, not from relief, but from terror. They had been told, repeatedly and emphatically, that the Americans would show no mercy. That occupation would mean mass executions, rape, and the systematic destruction of Japanese culture. Mothers prepared to kill their own children rather than let them fall into American hands. Families stockpiled poison. Some chose suicide over the shame and horror they believed awaited them. And then the Americans arrived, and they brought food. The operation was called the Government and Relief in Occupied Areas Program, known by its acronym GARIOA. It was an unprecedented undertaking. The United States government, having just concluded the most destructive war in human history, decided to feed its former enemy. Beginning in September 1945 and continuing through the early 1950s, America shipped millions of tons of food to Japan: wheat, corn, powdered milk, canned meat, rice, sugar. The initial goal was purely pragmatic: to prevent mass starvation and the social chaos that would inevitably follow. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, understood that a starving population would be vulnerable to communist agitation, and the early Cold War was already casting its shadow over Asia. But something else happened, something the planners had not fully anticipated. The act of feeding became a form of communication more powerful than any propaganda broadcast. In Yokohama, Kimiko Tanaka stood in that line and watched as American soldiers opened crate after crate of food. There was white bread, soft, impossibly white bread, unlike anything she had seen in years. There were cans of Spam, that peculiar processed meat that would become a fixture of post-war Japanese cuisine. There was powdered milk that could be reconstituted with water, providing essential nutrition to children whose bones had become brittle from calcium deficiency. The soldiers worked quickly, efficiently, but without the brutality Kimiko had been conditioned to expect. They didn't shout or strike anyone. When an elderly man stumbled and fell, a young American corporal helped him to his feet and ensured he received his full ration. When Kimiko's turn came, the freckled soldier handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. She took it with trembling hands and bowed deeply, an automatic gesture of subservience. But the soldier shook his head and did something that would remain etched in her memory for the rest of her life. He pulled out a chocolate bar from his own pocket, broke it in half, and offered her a piece. Then he gestured toward a makeshift table where several other soldiers were sitting down to eat their own meal. He was inviting her to join them. Kimiko hesitated. Every instinct, every lesson drilled into her by years of wartime propaganda screamed at her to refuse. To sit with the enemy, to eat alongside those who had burned her city and killed her countrymen, it was unthinkable. But she was hungry. She was so desperately, achingly hungry. And the chocolate in her hand smelled like something from a half-remembered dream. She sat down. The historical record from this period is filled with accounts similar to Kimiko's experience. Lieutenant Robert Eichelberger, who commanded the 8th Army during the occupation, wrote in his memoir, "We expected resistance, even guerrilla warfare. What we found instead was a population in shock, terrified of us but also starving. We fed them, and that changed everything." In his official reports, Eichelberger noted that within weeks of the occupation beginning, incidents of civilian hostility dropped to almost zero. It wasn't because the Japanese people suddenly embraced American values or forgot the horrors of the war. It was because the reality of American behavior contradicted everything they had been told. Japanese civilians had expected demons. They got farm boys from Iowa who showed them pictures of their families. They got soldiers from Brooklyn who helped rebuild schools. They got officers who insisted on treating Japanese workers with dignity and fairness. Most importantly, they got food, abundant, freely given food that came without demands for subservience or gratitude. A Japanese schoolteacher named Hiroshi Nakamura, who had lost his home in the Tokyo firebombing, wrote in his diary in October 1945, "The Americans give us food and ask nothing in return. They do not rape our women. They do not execute our men. They do not steal our possessions. I do not understand. Everything we were told was a lie. But if that was a lie, what else were we lied to about?" This cognitive dissonance, The violent collision between propaganda and reality created a psychological earthquake in Japanese society. For years, the government had insisted that the war was righteous, that sacrifice was noble, that the emperor was divine, and that Americans were subhuman monsters. Now, those monsters were feeding their children and helping to rebuild their cities. The implications were staggering and deeply destabilizing, but the act of sharing a meal carried even deeper significance in Japanese culture. The tradition of sharing food, of eating together, was not merely about sustenance. It was about trust, community, and the boundaries between insider and outsider. In Japanese society, meals were carefully structured affairs that reinforced social hierarchies and group identity. To invite someone to share your food was to acknowledge their humanity and include them in your social circle. For American soldiers to invite Japanese civilians to eat with them was to extend a form of respect that transcended military victory and occupation. The chocolate bar became a symbol. In the years following the war, chocolate, and American candy in general, took on an almost mythical quality in Japanese memory. It represented abundance, sweetness in the midst of bitterness, generosity from an unexpected source. Children who had never tasted chocolate before the Americans arrived would spend decades remembering that first bite. The way it melted on the tongue, the intense sweetness. The richness that spoke of a nation that had so much it could afford to give it away to strangers. Yoko Watanabe was 7 years old when she first tasted chocolate. She had been living in a refugee camp on the outskirts of Osaka. Her father dead from bombing. Her mother too ill to work. An American medic gave her a Hershey's bar while treating her mother's tuberculosis. "I didn't know what it was," Watanabe recalled in a 1985 interview. "I thought maybe it was medicine because it came from a doctor. When I tasted it, I cried. Not because it was good, though it was, but because I realized that people who had this kind of sweetness couldn't be evil. My mother had told me Americans ate babies. But people who eat babies don't have chocolate like this." This may seem like naive reasoning, but it reflects a deeper truth about human psychology and the power of material culture. The abundance that American forces represented, their well-fed soldiers, their endless supplies, their casual generosity with goods that were luxuries to the Japanese, communicated something about American society that no propaganda broadcast could have achieved. It suggested that America was a nation of such enormous productive capacity that it could fight a two-front war across 2 oceans, defeat powerful enemies, and still have surplus to feed those same enemies after victory. The historical data supports this impression. In 1945, while Japan's per capita GDP had collapsed to approximately $200 annually, America's stood at nearly $1,800. American agricultural productivity was such that despite feeding its own population, supplying its military, and supporting its allies, it could still export millions of tons of food to occupied territories. American factories, which had churned out tanks and bombers during the war, retooled almost overnight to produce consumer goods. The same industrial capacity that had crushed the Axis powers now turned toward reconstruction. Japanese civilians observed this with a mixture of awe and despair. How could they have hoped to defeat such a nation? The propaganda had told them that American soldiers were soft, that American society was decadent and weak, that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. But the reality was the opposite. American soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, and supported by an industrial base that seemed almost magical in its abundance. Japan had mobilized every resource, stripped every copper wire from homes for the war effort, sent its children to factories, and still had been utterly overwhelmed. The communal meals organized by American forces during the occupation took many forms. In some cities, mess halls were open to civilian workers who were helping with reconstruction efforts. Japanese laborers who cleared rubble or rebuilt roads were invited to eat in the same facilities as American soldiers. They sat at the same tables, ate the same food, and were treated with the same casual equality that characterized American military culture. This was revolutionary. In the rigid hierarchies of Japanese military and civilian society, such mixing of ranks and roles was unthinkable. Officers ate separately from enlisted men. Social classes maintained strict boundaries. The idea that a common laborer could sit down and share a meal with someone of higher status as equals was foreign to Japanese experience. Yet here were American privates eating alongside Japanese workers, sharing cigarettes, showing photographs, attempting to communicate through broken Japanese and hand gestures. Toshiro Mori, who worked as a translator for the occupation forces, observed, "The Americans treated us like human beings, not like inferiors, not like conquered people, but like men who happened to be on the wrong side of a war." This was incomprehensible to us. We had been taught that the strong dominate the weak, that the victor humiliates the vanquished. But they didn't humiliate us. They fed us. This didn't mean the occupation was without tension, or that all American soldiers behaved perfectly. There were incidents of theft, violence, and sexual assault. Military occupation is never benign, no matter how enlightened the occupying power attempts to be. But the overall pattern of American behavior during the occupation of Japan was marked by a restraint and generosity that contradicted Japanese expectations and historical precedents. Consider the contrast with Japanese occupation policy in Asia. In territories occupied by Japanese forces, food was systematically extracted to feed the Japanese military, often resulting in famines. The Bengal famine of 1943, which killed approximately 3 million people, was exacerbated by Japanese occupation of Burma and the disruption of rice imports to India. In Java, forced requisitions of rice led to widespread starvation. In Korea, the Japanese colonial government imposed harsh agricultural quotas that left Korean farmers with barely enough to survive. The pattern was clear. Japanese imperial policy was extractive, viewing conquered populations as resources to be exploited. American policy in Japan was the opposite. Rather than extracting resources from a defeated enemy, America pumped resources in. The Garioa program alone cost American taxpayers nearly $2 billion between 1946 and 1951, equivalent to approximately $23 billion in 2025 dollars. This was followed by additional economic aid, technical assistance, and the rebuilding of Japanese infrastructure. The Marshall Plan in Europe has received more historical attention, but the American investment in Japan's recovery was equally significant and equally unprecedented. But why? Why did America choose to feed its former enemy rather than punish or exploit them? The answer lies in a complex intersection of strategic calculation, ideological conviction, and the particular character of American political culture in the mid-20th century. Strategically, American planners understood that a stable, prosperous Japan would serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion in Asia. The Cold War was already beginning, and a Japan vulnerable to communist revolution would be a disaster for American interests in the Pacific. Feeding the Japanese population was the most effective way to prevent the chaos that could lead to political radicalization. But strategy alone doesn't explain the character of the occupation. There was also a genuine ideological component, a belief rooted in American political philosophy that democracy and prosperity were mutually reinforcing, and that even former enemies could be transformed through the introduction of democratic institutions and economic opportunity. This was perhaps naive in some respects, but it was also genuinely held. The Americans who designed and implemented occupation policy believed that Japan could be remade, that the authoritarian militarism that had led to war could be replaced with something better. And there was something else, something harder to quantify, but visible in countless individual interactions, a kind of basic decency that characterized many American soldiers' behavior toward Japanese civilians. These were men who had fought a brutal war, who had lost friends, who had every reason to hate their former enemies. Yet many of them, when faced with starving children and desperate families, responded with compassion rather than vengeance. Private First Class Daniel McCarthy, a farm boy from Nebraska who served in the occupation forces, wrote to his mother in December 1945, "You should see these people, Ma. They've got nothing. Kids with no shoes, even in winter. Old folks who look like skeletons. When we give out food, they look at us like we're saints or something. Makes me feel strange, because just a few months ago we were trying to kill each other. But I can't hate them now. They're just people, like us. They got caught up in something terrible, same as we did." This sentiment was not universal among occupation forces, but it was common enough to shape the overall character of American-Japanese interactions during the occupation period. And Japanese civilians noticed. The transformation in Japanese public opinion toward Americans was remarkably swift. A survey conducted by the occupation authorities in March 1946, just 7 months after surrender, found that 63% of Japanese respondents viewed American occupation forces favorably. By 1948, that number had risen to 78%. These figures are extraordinary when one considers that the respondents had recently experienced devastating bombing campaigns, including nuclear attacks at American hands. The same survey asked respondents what aspects of the occupation they viewed most favorably. The most common response was food aid and relief supplies. The second most common was fair treatment and respect. The third was help with reconstruction. Only 11% cited democratic reforms as the most important positive aspect of the occupation, suggesting that material reality trumped ideological abstractions in shaping public opinion. Kimiko Tanaka, who had stood in that food line in Yokohama, found herself gradually pulled into a new understanding of the world. She began working as a domestic helper for an American military family stationed in Yokohama. Captain Richard Morrison and his wife Helen treated Kimiko with a kindness she had not expected. They paid her fairly, fed her meals with their family, and when they learned she could read and write English, Mrs. Morrison began teaching her more advanced language skills. On Thanksgiving Day 1946, the Morrisons insisted that Kimiko join them for the holiday meal. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, foods entirely foreign to her, but prepared with obvious care and celebration. They thanked God for their blessings and included me in that thanks, Kimiko recalled decades later. They said they were grateful to have me in their home, grateful for peace, grateful that the war was over. I realized then that they had suffered too. They had feared for their husbands and sons. They had made sacrifices. The war had hurt them also, even though they won. This made them seem more human to me, more real. They were not conquerors enjoying their victory. They were people who were relieved that the killing had stopped. This personal connection replicated itself thousands of times across Japan during the occupation years. Japanese civilians who worked for American forces, who interacted with American soldiers, who received food and medical care from American relief organizations, these people became ambassadors of a new understanding. They returned to their communities with stories that contradicted the old propaganda. They spoke of American generosity, American fairness, American abundance. Slowly, painfully, Japanese society began to reconstruct its understanding of the world and its place within it. The symbolic power of shared meals extended beyond mere sustenance. Food carries cultural meaning, and the way it is shared communicates values and assumptions about social relationships. When American soldiers invited Japanese civilians to eat with them, they were, perhaps without fully realizing it, enacting a fundamental principle of democratic culture, the idea that all people possess inherent dignity regardless of their social status, nationality, or circumstances. This was a revolutionary concept in the context of 1940s Japan. The Japanese Empire had been built on explicit hierarchies, the divine emperor at the apex, the military aristocracy below, the common people further down, and conquered peoples at the bottom. Social relationships were defined by clear superordinate and subordinate positions. The idea that individuals possessed rights and dignity independent of their position in the social hierarchy was foreign to traditional Japanese political culture. American occupation policy, for all its flaws and contradictions, attempted to introduce this concept. The new Japanese Constitution, drafted under American supervision and promulgated in 1947, began with a declaration that sovereignty resided in the people, not the emperor. It guaranteed individual rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and equal treatment under law. Land reform broke up the old feudal estates and distributed land to tenant farmers. Labor unions were legalized and encouraged. Women received the right to vote for the first time in Japanese history. These were profound structural changes imposed from above by an occupying power. But they might have remained mere legal abstractions had they not been accompanied by the daily, lived experience of different social relations. When American soldiers treated Japanese workers as equals, when they shared meals and cigarettes and stories, when they helped rebuild homes and schools, they were modeling a different way of organizing human relationships. They were demonstrating, through action rather than words, what democratic culture looked like in practice. The chocolate bar that Kimiko received in January 1946 thus represented something more than sweetness. It represented the possibility of a world organized around different principles: abundance rather than scarcity, generosity rather than exploitation, equality rather than hierarchy. It was a small thing, easily dismissed as insignificant. But small things, repeated millions of times, can transform societies. Not everyone experienced the occupation positively, and not every American soldier behaved with honor. The historical record includes accounts of violence, discrimination, and cultural insensitivity. Some American soldiers viewed Japanese civilians with contempt, or behaved in ways that reinforced, rather than challenged, racial prejudices. The occupation authorities made significant mistakes, including the initial decision to work through the existing Japanese bureaucracy, which meant that many of the officials who had enabled Japanese militarism remained in positions of power. Moreover, the generosity of American food aid must be understood in the context of Cold War geopolitics. The United States was not acting purely from altruistic motives. The decision to rebuild Japan, rather than punish it, was driven primarily by the desire to create a stable, anti-communist ally in Asia. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, Japan's value as an American military base became even more apparent, and American aid increased accordingly. The Japanese people were beneficiaries of this aid, but they were also objects of American strategic planning. Yet even when we account for these complexities and qualifications, the basic fact remains: America chose to feed its former enemy. This choice was not inevitable. History provides many examples of victorious powers that chose differently, that extracted reparations, imposed harsh penalties, or simply allowed defeated populations to starve. The Treaty of Versailles after World War I had imposed crushing reparations on Germany, contributing to economic collapse and the eventual rise of Nazism. The Soviet Union's treatment of occupied territories in Eastern Europe was marked by systematic extraction and repression. Even within the American tradition, there were precedents for harsher treatment. The Reconstruction period after the Civil War had been marked by punitive policies toward the defeated Confederacy. But in Japan, America chose a different path. And that choice, that decision to extend abundance rather than inflict scarcity, to offer inclusion rather than impose exclusion, had profound and lasting consequences. By 1950, Japan's economy was beginning to recover. Agricultural production had returned to pre-war levels. Industrial capacity was being rebuilt, often with American technical assistance. The Korean War, which began in June 1950, provided an unexpected economic stimulus as American forces purchased supplies and services from Japanese companies. The Japanese economy entered a period of rapid growth that would continue for decades, eventually transforming Japan into the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s. This economic miracle had many causes: Japanese cultural emphasis on education and hard work, effective government-industrial policy, the benefits of adopting new technologies without the burden of obsolete infrastructure, the security provided by the American military umbrella. But the foundation was laid during those occupation years when American aid prevented complete social collapse and created the conditions for recovery. Kimiko Tanaka lived to see this transformation. She continued working for American families through the early 1950s, saving her wages and learning English. In 1953, she married a Japanese businessman who had studied in the United States under a program sponsored by the occupation authorities. She opened a small restaurant in Yokohama that specialized in fusion cuisine, combining Japanese ingredients with cooking techniques she had learned from American military wives. The restaurant became modestly successful. She raised 3 children, all of whom attended university, something that would have been impossible for someone of her social class before the war. In a 1988 interview conducted for an oral history project, Kimiko reflected on her experiences during the occupation. "When I stood in that food line in 1946, I was certain I would die. I thought the Americans would shoot us or let us starve. Instead, they gave me chocolate. That sounds silly, I know, to say that a piece of chocolate changed my life. But it did. It made me question everything I had been taught. If the Americans were not demons, then perhaps the war had not been righteous. If they could be kind to us after we had fought them so bitterly, then perhaps kindness was possible between any peoples. That chocolate was proof that the world I had been shown was not the only possible world." The legacy of the occupation remains complex and contested in both American and Japanese historical memory. In America, the occupation of Japan is often cited as a success story, proof that defeated enemies can be transformed into democratic allies. This narrative is not entirely wrong, but it simplifies a messy and complicated process. In Japan, the occupation period is remembered with ambivalence, gratitude for American aid, and the introduction of democratic reforms, but also discomfort with the reality of military occupation and the loss of sovereignty that it represented. The relationship between the United States and Japan remains shaped by the occupation experience, a mixture of alliance and dependence, partnership and hierarchy. But for the individuals who lived through it, who experienced that moment when expectation collided with reality, the occupation meant something more personal and immediate. It meant survival. It meant the difference between starvation and sustenance, between despair and hope. It meant discovering that the world was larger and more complicated than propaganda had suggested. The soldiers who served in the occupation forces mostly returned home to America and resumed ordinary lives. They became farmers, businessmen, teachers, factory workers. Most did not think of themselves as having participated in anything historically significant. They had simply done their jobs, following orders, trying to be decent in circumstances that were often confusing and difficult. They had shared their rations with hungry civilians because it seemed like the right thing to do, not because they were enacting some grand ideological project. And yet, in aggregate, these individual acts of ordinary decency helped to transform Japanese society and reshape the geopolitical order of Asia. The meals shared, the chocolate bars given to children, the respectful treatment of former enemies, these small gestures communicated something about American values and the possibilities of democratic culture more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have done. There is a photograph, taken in Osaka in March 1946, that captures something of this transformation. It shows a group of Japanese children gathered around an American soldier who is distributing candy. The children are thin, their clothes ragged, but they are smiling. The soldier, a young man, probably no more than 20, is kneeling down to be at eye level with the smallest child. He is offering a Tootsie Roll, and the child is reaching out to take it, tentative but trusting. In the background, Japanese adults watch the scene, their expressions unreadable, but their posture relaxed, not defensive. This photograph was taken by a military photographer as part of the occupation's public information efforts. It was meant to be propaganda, proof of American benevolence and Japanese gratitude. As such, we should view it with some skepticism. It shows what the occupation authorities wanted people to see, not necessarily the full reality. But even propaganda can reveal truth. The smiles on those children's faces were real. The candy was real. The fact that a Japanese parent would allow their child to approach an American soldier, to take food from him, to trust him, that was real too. And it represented a dramatic shift from the fear and hatred that had characterized Japanese attitudes just months earlier. The photograph was published in Stars and Stripes and in several American newspapers. It was meant to reassure the American public that the occupation was going well, that their tax dollars were being spent wisely, that their sons serving in Japan were doing good work. But the photograph's significance extends beyond its propaganda function. It documents a moment of genuine human connection across the chasm of war, defeat, and cultural difference. It shows the power of simple generosity to begin healing the wounds of conflict. In the end, what the Japanese civilians learned from eating with Americans was not a simple lesson. It was not that America was good and Japan was bad, or that democracy was superior to all other forms of government, or that the war had been justified. The lesson was more subtle and more profound, that people are not the demons that propaganda makes them out to be. That generosity can come from unexpected sources, that abundance shared can transform relationships, that the world can change, sometimes suddenly and dramatically, in ways that defy expectation. For Kimiko Tanaka, standing in that food line in Yokohama in January 1946, the world had ended with Japan's surrender. The certainties that had structured her life, the divine emperor, the righteousness of the cause, the evil of the enemy, had all collapsed. She stood in the ruins of her city, hungry and afraid, waiting for the demons to arrive. Instead, she received chocolate. That chocolate could not bring back the dead. It could not rebuild the bombed cities or heal the trauma of war. It could not erase the terrible things that had been done in Japan's name, or the terrible things that had been done to Japan. But it could, and did, open a small space for a different future. It suggested that the relationship between victor and vanquished need not be one of domination and revenge. It offered proof that even in the aftermath of the most destructive war in history, human beings could choose to treat each other with dignity and kindness. The Japanese civilians who experienced the American occupation learned something that would shape their nation for generations, that democracy was not just a system of government, but a way of relating to other human beings. That abundance was not just about material wealth, but about the spirit of sharing. That freedom was not just the absence of tyranny, but the presence of respect and equality. These lessons were learned not from lectures or textbooks, but from lived experience, from standing in food lines and receiving rations without humiliation, from working alongside American soldiers and being treated as equals, from sitting down to share a meal with former enemies and discovering their common humanity. The occupation of Japan ended officially in 1952 when the Treaty of San Francisco went into effect and Japan regained its sovereignty. But the transformation that began during those occupation years continued. Japan became and remained a democracy, imperfect and sometimes turbulent, but fundamentally different from the militaristic autocracy that had led the nation to war. The Japanese-American alliance, forged in the aftermath of devastating conflict, became one of the most stable and important relationships in international politics. And the memory of those early days of the occupation, the fear that turned to relief, the hunger that was satisfied, the expectations that were overturned, remained embedded in Japanese cultural memory. Kimiko Tanaka died in 2003 at the age of 79. In her obituary, published in a Yokohama newspaper, Her children mentioned that she had kept, for more than 50 years, the wrapper from a Hershey's chocolate bar. It was brittle and faded, the lettering barely visible, but she had preserved it, this small piece of foil and paper, as a reminder of the day the world changed. The day she learned that enemies could become friends, that abundance could be shared, that the future need not be determined by the hatreds of the past. That chocolate wrapper, fragile and insignificant, was a symbol of something larger, the power of generosity to transform understanding, the possibility of reconciliation even after terrible violence, and the resilience of human dignity in the face of suffering and loss. It was a reminder that history is made not only by the great decisions of generals and politicians, but also by the small gestures of ordinary people who choose kindness over cruelty, abundance over scarcity, hope over despair. And it testified to a truth that transcends the particular circumstances of post-war Japan, that how we treat those we have defeated reveals who we are far more than the fact of our victory. That true power lies not in the capacity to destroy, but in the capacity to build, to heal, to share. That the most revolutionary act in the aftermath of war is not vengeance, but grace. The Americans who arrived in Japan in 1945 brought with them bombs and tanks and overwhelming military might. But what changed Japan was not the force of American weapons, but the force of American abundance, the abundance of food freely given, of dignity freely offered, of a future freely shared. In the end, it was not military power that won Japanese hearts, but the simple act of breaking bread together, of extending an invitation to the table, of treating former enemies as human beings worthy of respect and care. This is the lesson that Kimiko Tanaka learned on that winter day in Yokohama, standing in a food line with a chocolate bar in her hand and the ruins of war all around her. This is the lesson that transformed a nation and shaped a generation. This is the truth that survives in memory long after the battles are forgotten and the soldiers have gone home. That in our treatment of others, especially those we have power over, we reveal the content of our own souls and the character of our own civilizations, and that sometimes, in the midst of history's greatest catastrophes, ordinary acts of kindness can plant seeds that blossom into something approaching redemption.